Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sandra Grudic, and I'm the Education Outreach Administrator at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We're delighted to host this webinar featuring the Blavatnik Archive and its remarkable digital collections. Today's presentation will explore materials related to Soviet history, World War II, 20th century Jewish culture, and the Holocaust. These collections include personal and widely circulated artifacts such as postcards, photographs, illustrations, posters, and letters, offering powerful insight into the everyday experience of history. These visually compelling and deeply human primary sources provide valuable opportunities for classroom engagement, helping students connect more meaningfully with subjects such as history, social studies, and media literacy. This session will also introduce the archive's digital platform and highlight ways educators and scholars are using these materials in teaching and research. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. We have two speakers from the Blavatnik Archive today. First one is Brandon Schechter. He serves as historian to the Blavatnik Archive and is currently a visiting professor of history at Sarah Lawrence College. He has taught at Brown, Columbia, New York University, NYU Shanghai, and the University of California, Berkeley, where he earned his PhD. His first book, The Stuff of Soldiers, A History of the Red Army in World War II Through Objects, received the American Historical Association's Paul Birdsall Prize in 2020. He's currently working on a comparative study of U.S. Army chaplains and Red Army political workers during the Second World War and regularly contributes interpretative writing on the archive's collections. His work has been supported by fellowships from the Fulbright Institute of International Education, Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, the Kennan Institute, and the Library of Congress Klug Center. We are also joined by Julie Rains Chervinsky. She's director of Blavatnik Archive. She received her Bachelor's of Arts in Journalism from Syracuse University and has led the archive since its founding in 2005. Under her leadership, the archive has built a dynamic digital platform that provides free and broad access to its collections with a focus on preserving materials and perspectives that are often overlooked. Julie brings nearly 2 decades of experience managing archival collections and developing academic and public programs, including fellowships, conferences, and exhibitions. We are very grateful to both of our speakers for being here with us this evening, and they will share their insights and knowledge with you all. With that, I will turn it over to Brandon and Julie. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Julie. Thank you so much, Dr. Grudich, for the invitation, for the introduction to the Davis Center, for the amazing program that you run. We're just thrilled to join you and to be part of this. And because of thank you again for the incredible introduction that you've done, I don't need to bore the rest of you with some of the overview, which is fantastic. So, right, as noted, we started about 21 years ago in 2005, started with a collection of 10,000 Judaica postcards. Really, that's where it sort of all began, and made this incredible just discovery that these small pieces of popular objects captured so much in them, kind of as a first form, I would say, of social media, bringing together visuals, a state message, and a limited use of space for personal writing and correspondence. As mentioned, that was 21 years ago. I'm going to go ahead and share screen so you don't need to just look at me. There's other things to look at. I think you see the screen. Yes? Okay, good. Um, and so, as I mentioned, we started with 10,000 Judaica postcards. Currently in our collections, we have over 145,000 items. They are individual. We're a little different from other archives in the sense of we treat everything item-based and record-based. So over 145,000 items, as mentioned on World Wars One and Two, Jewish culture, modern Jewish culture, and Soviet and Russian history. Um, and that's over probably more than 30 collections. A long time ago, we made the decision to really become a digital archive, meaning we have these materials, they're physically accessible. You can come and visit us, but our commitment is to make them as freely, widely accessible as possible. And so we're going to just dive into what some of these collections mean. Here in the collections section, we have a brief descriptions of what these collections are. And so, for example, if we look at the Boris Yefimov collection, and what I'm going to really try to do is kind of talk about the collections, but really also show you the different tools that are available here, sort of what the information means. And so over here, there's a description. This is one of the most prolific uh, Soviet cartoonists whose career spanned more than 8 decades, since he passed away at the age of 108. And I believe he started drawing in his 20s. And there's a short description. We have here 125 total items. You can see that of those 125, 124 are online. This is very, very visual, predominantly actually Cold War illustrations. They are fantastic, and we'll sort of get into them a little more. But just so you see the information that those descriptions give you. So a brief description of the collection and how much of it is online. I'm going to show you a collection where World War I postcards, we have 52,000 total postcards on World War I. Only about 1,500 of those are online. So you know that there's a lot more. We're continuously growing archive, and we're digitizing, not just digitizing, but also cataloging. And so what this kind of reflects what we like in our what we look for in our collections. It's something that tells a full story through a unique medium, whether it's sort of subject matter that isn't captured by other institutions, or in a way that's not captured by other institutions. So, for example, this is World War I, 52,000 postcards in the heyday of their production, and many of them are written on the back. I'm going to show you another collection. And so we're going to look at the Moscow State Yiddish Theater Collection. And the reason I want to point out again, 580 items. The reason I want to point that out, there's a description here. This came through the personal archive of two of the actors, Solomon Silberblatt and Milkova Justina. And it's only here we have 578 items. But as a result of what we've done with this collection, again, we're going to sort of look to see what that means online. We were descendants of other actors wanted to share materials about their in this case, it's two sons who share the collections of their mothers, who were also actors in this theater. And so there's the Rosa Kurtz and the Hama Sirotz in the collection. And so some, again, are growing collections because of the material that we already have. There's a connection. And one more that I wanted to highlight is the one that we're probably sort of the most known for, and that's the Veterans Testimony and Ephemera Collection. And this one is the result of a project that we did where we went out and we interviewed Jewish soldiers who fought in the Soviet Armed Forces during World War II. We did these interviews in 11 different countries. We have nearly 1,200 interviews recorded, and we asked them to also bring personal archives that we digitized on site. So out of 14,000 total, there's 4,225 here. So I mentioned that an item-based archive, and I'll show you what that means. And actually, we can go from the collection. So for example, we noted that there were, let's say, 124 here. Now we can see what is actually online, and now it's filtered by that specific collection. This is all the Boris Yefimov items that we have, and you can select any one of them. There's infinite zoom. There's a description over here. Um, and there's sort of the metadata, subjects, and the details that are underneath. Um, but the beauty of the system is that you can search across all the collections. So for example, if I put in theater, this will give me results that are whether they're in the Moscow State Yiddish Theater or a traveling theater that was in World War I postcard, or again, so this was in the Solomon Machoil's collection. I can see all of my results and I can access any one of them by, of course, selecting it. So in addition, we see 1,454 items that are result, and we can see what types of items are in those 1,450 results. So we can just look at photographs, for example, or we can just look at letters where a theater is mentioned. So there's different ways to sort through that material. Um, we can also filter by collection itself. So out of the 1,400 results, if let's say I only want to see the results in a specific collection, you can filter
Right.
that. So there's just different ways to look at that material. Another way I'm just going to show you search facets is by subject. And so if we go to subject and see all subjects, this is by the count of the results, or over here on the bottom, I can filter by name. And so this will give me an alphabetical listing of the subjects. I'm going to, in fact, go ahead and take you through to Soviet, let's see, Soviet policies and programs. Let's see everything that we have on there. And I'm going to apply, and it gives me 55 items as result. One function I want to show you is, let's say of the 55 items, I only want to see my postcards that promote policies, Soviet policies, and I want to see stamps, because what I'm looking for is how do they sort of relay these policies through popular objects to a mass population. And these are my results. I can look at it closely to see the visuals. But what I can also do is I want to say, I want to save this to work with this later. And so I can literally save to a folder. You can create a folder. Um, all you need is really all of this. There's no subscription, there's no fees. You create a folder with just your email and your name. And so, for example, if I create Soviet policy, I created a folder and I save it in that folder to then return. I'll show you in a second. I want to save this. I want to save this to my Soviet policy, and we'll return to it to look for it. So this is one way to sort of gather your results, either for your own personal research or for something that you may want to use in a classroom later, because again, sort of for a classroom, there's an overwhelming probably volume of content that is here. So there's just different ways to sort, to work with it, to save. I'm going to show you one more function, which is uh, it's actually, you can compare different images. So that's this check mark. And well, I just blocked my own screen. So I can compare the two items and it'll put them side by side. So you can do it with sort of policy to see how they're doing, how agriculture. You can search for all the cats that are in our archive. There's quite a few of them, and you can see how they're depicted. There's whiskers, there's cats, there's rats, kind of any word that you can think of for really any kind of classroom. Um, so that's just another way that I wanted to sort of share with you how to work with the material. Um, we're going to do one more exercise to show you then how you can work with the actual items. As you can see, it didn't find anything on the Holocaust because I had these other um, filters that I can remove. So I just searched for the Holocaust to see what is in our collections. And I'm going to focus on letters right now. Um, I selected letters, and here's a result that I'm going to look at. So what I want to show you are all the different layers of information in a single item where they're available. So in this case, it's a letter. This letter is in Russian. It is, there's a description that is right over here. If I go below that description, so there's infinite zoom, and whatever item that we have, if it's 1 page, 2 pages, 10 pages in a periodical, 20 pages, every every page, every side, every part of that item will be viewable and available and maximum zoom. That's wonderful, except for it is in Russian, it is handwritten, and so that remains a barrier for a lot of users, especially I think for students. So for our source Russian material, if you look at the other tabs here, we have transcript. The transcript is both in English, that's the translation. Um, if you don't trust us, totally understandable. There's the source Russian that you can look at, which is right over here. You can create a PDF. So I know there's sort of so many pieces to this, but I will be happy later at the end to answer questions and, to follow up. Just want to introduce you to all the different parts that are for you to be able to expect when you're working with this material. So there's again, the transcript, and what you can do, you can download the page, you can download the transcript, you can download the the record directly to your computer. So now that's for a letter. I mentioned the Veteran Testimony Project to you before when we were looking at the collections. What this means is this is part of this veteran's personal collection. You see the name of the veteran here, and I can go to the veteran and see the veteran's entire biography. I can see the personal archive for that veteran, meaning the letters that were written, if they exist. We have certainly, I don't want to mislead you and think that everybody had a lot of material, but some certainly did. The postcards that they sent, uh, and the interview that we did with the veteran. So in this case, there's a full interview. And just so to see, this is a long format item, which means we took that interview. There's the description, of course, you can read about the interview. Um, there's an index of it, we divide it into segments. There's a description of each segment. It's based on time codes. You can see the first segment is 0 to 6 minutes. And the way we divide it is kind of whole stories or whole segments that kind of made sense to keep together. It's not sort of by the minute. It's if they're talking about a specific topic, we kept that together. So you can, the interview itself is in source Russian. These interviews are in source Russian for the veteran project. We're working on a new project right now that's English, that's on the Soviet Jewry movement, but this is source Russian. So you can read the description, you can see the subjects, you can read the entire transcript for this interview. Again, in English, in Russian, and in source. So Interviews and diaries, which we'll get into a little later, are the long source formats where there's an index and a lot of information about each. Now, the subjects that I mentioned, each subject is cross collection. So, for example, this subject, departure from Jewish rites and ceremonies, if I want to see everything else that might be tagged in all of the collections, I would just hit this and it would give me the results across all collections, not just in veteran testimonies. So I didn't actually test this. Yes, we have other things tagged with that, and it does look like it's mostly in the testimonies when they talk about sort of whether usually it's about their grandparents who followed those Jewish rites, and then probably as the Soviet Union sort of changed the rules, they stopped. So I just wanted to show you all the different levels of information and the connection to the veterans where it's available. Uh, Now, if this will search in text, in subjects, in whatever area that it is. So I'm just going to give you one more example in these items. So for example, I just searched the word sour for no particular reason. Um, and it will bring up any material that will have that. Or if I search, let's say, Kiev, and I can see what are the different types of materials where Kiev is mentioned, whether again it's in a letter, whether it's a photograph, a postcard. And if you, for example, here you see segments 1, 3, and 7, that means this person is speaking about Kiev more in those segments. And that's the index that I showed you. So let's just take a quick look. There's the index, and we know that it's in segments 1, 3, and 7 that this person discusses Kiev. Um, we didn't, so lots of different ways to search, lots of different ways to find and work with the content that is here. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the section called stories, where this is where we bring together some of the analysis, some of the deep dives, some of the background context, as well as models for potentially what can be done with the material. I'm just going to highlight quickly two. One is this one is called Deep Dive into Postcards. Uh, and this really takes a anti-Semitic postcard and dives into first identifying the different symbols that are in this postcard, explaining those different symbols, creating the context about those symbols, and uh, and what is the intended message of the composition. I want to really bring your attention to these are very short and brief content text paragraphs, really specifically targeting for a classroom, something that is highly visual, really points to how to highlight different materials. And at the end of the day, it's international. That's probably the most remarkable part about this postcard is it's in 3 different languages, really encouraging sort of the international attention to the mistreatment of the Jewish neighbors in different countries. So that's a deep dive type of format, which I think could work as an amazing model for, showing that and then taking an image for a classroom to kind of go through a similar exercise to question what do these different symbols mean, to question why is it there, what's the intended message. And I'm going to share with you one more image. This is not a story, but it is actually part of a project that we're doing. So this is in our Siege of Siege of Leningrad postcards collection. These are postcards that were published predominantly during the siege in Leningrad. And we're doing an entire project of why, when, millions, or a million people, or around a million people starved to death, why was the state putting so many resources into producing these beautiful postcards? We have a collection of 1,330, I believe. Of those, about 665 are unique. And again, they're beautiful colors. And so this is one where it's produced in November 1941, and it's a wonderful sort of start for asking the questions of, just without any context, what do you see? What do you think of this? What could it mean? What, just what, any observations? Um, and then reading a little bit of information about it. Who is the artist? What is the point of this? Why are they all looking at this letter? What is the absence? Why is there this picture on the wall? Um, the story is incredible. 1941, when it's probably the worst time of the war, and yet this idyllic sort of setting, fairy tale look. It's drawn by a children's illustrator, Vasnitsov, and this is his hometown. And so the message is, A, it's encouraging people to write to each other. It's encouraging soldiers to remember what they're fighting for, the home, to protect their family. And it's encouraging the family to remember the soldier, that and that they will be okay. They will be reunited. So a simple postcard with so much meaning, once you dig into it, can have so many different applications, beginning with even the most elementary. Really, I've actually used this in my kids' kindergarten 30, many, many years ago, just encouraging, here's a postcard, write something on it. We go to the mailbox and it's sent. And it's the most wonderful, tangible sort of experience, including the mailman trying to deliver it on very difficult to read addresses. Um, and so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we've been incredibly fortunate to work, obviously, together with uh, Brandon Schechter, who's going to show you how he works with the material.
All right, thank you very much for that warm introduction, Sandra and Julie, and thank you all for spending some time with us tonight. So I should start off by saying if we only briefly discuss something that you're interested in, we are always available to consult via email, Zoom, or in person if you happen to be in the New York area. What I'm going to try to do today is talk a little bit about classroom use and my use as a scholar of some of our resources. I teach courses on material culture, violence, Soviet history, Second World War, and European history. Um, and as a historian, I have basically two major themes: how objects can tell stories and how events of epic scale are experienced by individuals. I'm very much focused on everyday life. And a lot of my teaching centers on how people navigated authoritarian regimes and catastrophic events. So making these epic scale events personal, which is, one of the major goals of this archive. And so, you know, I realize many of you are coming from not a higher education standpoint. Many of you are, we have a mix of educators, we have a mix of researchers, we have a mix of archivists based on who registered for all this. So I'm going to try to pitch it to kind of everyone. And if we can expand on anything during Q&A, I'd be happy to do that. So I'm going to start off by talking about a collection that I cataloged and that I wrote a story interpreting, which is Yevgeny Kagan, who was a graphic artist who served on the front. And this is one of these, one of these story collections or one of these stories interpreting one of our collections, that basically tries to center his experience as a graphic artist working in the army, talking about, the ways in which propaganda worked, the system of propaganda in the Red Army, his experience as, kind of a upwardly mobile young man in the early Soviet Union, and some information on, this massive print network of propaganda that's being produced, the sources that he's drawing from. So a lot of what he is doing is orders from above. There's a holiday. We need to have a special illustration and issue for a holiday, or things that the army is encountering at a given point. So some of what he is doing is, just kind of soldiers' everyday life. Again, this encouraging of connections, right to your family, stay connected, the connection to the home front and the battlefront. Some of what he's doing is documenting atrocities that they are hearing about or experiencing. So, the use of slave labor, atrocities committed by Germans and the calls for vengeance. A lot of what he is doing is making fun of the Germans. So they have a special kind of humor magazine that they do sometimes, and a lot of talking about, making Hitler look ridiculous, talking about how uncultured the Germans are, where they're supposed to be this, superior race. There's a lot of Hitler in drag and Goebbels as a monkey. There's a lot of Germans missing body parts, and just kind of interpreting this collection. And, one of the things that is part of this collection is probably my single most favorite object that we have in the archive, which is a soiled wrapper from April of 1942 that Kogan did the design for. This is essentially the equivalent of a ramen packet in modern day parlance. This is something that there's very few surviving of because they were simply meant to be thrown away. And this is something that I have also written a story about, where I talk about, the only reason this was saved was because he did the artwork for it and he did the graphic design for it. So it became part of this collection that we acquired. And in the story that I wrote for the archive, I talk about the various stories that can be told through this. This is a story in part about Soviet food production and the Soviet obsession with, massive production of agriculture while also collectivizing and essentially, insurfing the population of the peasant population of the Soviet Union, which is the majority, but also telling a story about modernized food production, that this is a concentrated millet package. So it's actually a fairly high-tech food stuff, and tying that to ideas of, the Nazis are waging this war in part because they're obsessed with food security themselves. And the Nazis are looting the Soviet Union extensively for food. And then also talking about the ways in which the Red Army is fed, the ways in which this tells a story of a certain machismo in the Red Army. And this is in some ways modeled off of an assignment that I often give in a class that I teach on socialist material culture, where students are supposed to put together a kind of virtual exhibit of Soviet material culture. So I'll move from there to talking a little bit about another story that I wrote that what my friend and colleague Steve Norris often uses. I wrote a story about censorship and readership in the Red Army, using some of our collections that I'll talk a little bit more about the collections themselves in a moment, but just the very specific ways in which Red Army soldiers could and could not write about certain topics, and the ways in which, in a massive war in which people were separated from their loved ones and in which many people did not survive, the only form of communication that people had was very much constrained by the government. It was constrained by not being able to talk about military secrets, so not being able to talk about where people were located. It was constrained by the um, the main political apparatus of the Red Army trying to control soldiers and civilians' moods, so trying to keep certain types of information that might be demoralizing out, but also a constantly shifting regime of censorship, and a regime of censorship that relied on largely on massively overworked teenage girls who were reading 500, 600 letters. And we actually have an interview with one of these women, reading 500 to 600 letters a day, and really just trying to cross out the most obvious things, and whose eyes are, glazing over by letter 300. So in that, I talk a little, I set up what could and could not be said, and the ways in which that's it's often imperfect. And our friend and colleague Stephen Norris at Oxford University in Ohio, or sorry, Miami University in Ohio, in Oxford, Ohio, um, has an assignment that he gives in his World War II course where he basically says, okay, you know what the constraints are for writing a letter home. Now imagine that you are a Red Army soldier at a certain point, in 1942. What does your letter home look like to your loved ones? What can you write about? What can't you write about? And do some sort of like meta commentary on that. So that's one of the ways in which our our resources have been used in the classroom. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about two of my favorite collections here that I have used extensively, both in my own research and in the classroom. The first is Boris Komsky, who arrived at the front just in time for the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in world history. And one of the things that we have that is so remarkable about Komsky is that there was both an interview that he gave, and he kept a wartime diary that is simply amazing. This diary records his experiences from the Battle of Kursk until January of 1945. He is a very interesting guy in that he is starts off as a Komsomol member and then becomes a Communist Party member. So he is a dedicated communist on the one hand, but he's also very critical. And he's also just a young guy trying to figure things out. So a lot of it is about his um, search for love with как говорит по-русски, переменными успехами, his occasionally successful search for love, his occasionally frustrated search for love, his search for meaning. He has incredible descriptions of battle. He has very vivid descriptions of the often fraught meetings with locals after liberation, incredible descriptions of just the destruction of war, including the destruction that he and his comrades were engaged in, as well as what it was like to be injured and medical care during the war. And with all of our resources, we have this both in English translation and in source Russian. Um, what we also have is the interview that was conducted with him in the 2000s. So, an assignment that I have given in classes before is you read Komsky's diary, you listen to Komsky's interview, and in a college setting, what I have done is also assigned a number of secondary sources on diary writing, on oral history, on Jews in the Red Army. And you see what is this guy talking about in 1943 that he doesn't want to talk about in the 2000s? What remains the same? He recites he was a poet as well, and so he recites some of his poems from memory. Some of the same poems that appear in the diary um, also appear in his interview in his oral history. But he also mentions some things in the oral history that he doesn't mention in the diary, and vice versa. So it's a very interesting study where we have both a contemporary account and someone looking back at the twilight of their life on the same set of events. And I mean, it's great stuff for just like history of memory, lived experience, and so on. And in my research, Komsky figures as an absolutely central figure in both the first book that I wrote, because he has very vivid descriptions about all of his equipment, what it means, the various objects that he's interacting with, and just his everyday experience. Um, and in my current work on, Red Army political workers compared to chaplains, he is a very interesting guy because, again, he is a dedicated communist, but he is also very critical of those around him and very critical of his of both fellow soldiers and fellow citizens. And so you have a kind of an insider's view of a guy who is dedicated to the project, but who is not, he's not a non-thinking automaton. He's actually quite an interesting individual. Moving on from Komsky, I'm going to talk about another incredible resource that we have, which is I think one of the most exciting resources that we have, which is the Consiticus family letters. What this is is over 600 letters from a couple during the Second World War. Basically, Solomon, also known as Sasha, or Sergei, sorry, Solomon, also known as Sergei Kantsidikas, and his wife Elisheva, who he usually refers to as Sheva, they were communists in the interwar period. She grew up in Poland, he grew up in Lithuania. And when the Soviet Union annexed the western parts of Poland and the Baltic states, they went from being underground members of the Communist Party to communist functionaries. And he ends up serving in the Red Army, and she ends up being evacuated to Kuibyshev. And what we have that is so incredibly rare is both the letters to the front and from the front. Usually we have letters from the front. It's very rare to have letters from the home front to the front because they usually get destroyed in the course of the war. And this is an incredibly rich source that deals with propaganda because he was a political officer in the Red Army. So part of his job was bringing the message of, of the Soviet Union, of the Red Army to soldiers. Uh, Elisheva, for her part, was also a propagandist on the home front, and later became a journalist. You get an incredibly rich uh, description of what it's like to raise a small child while in evacuation, and then eventually she returns to war-torn Vilnius after its liberation, and just how incredible it's amazing that she keeps their child alive. Their child, by the way, later becomes a major figure, art historian in the history of Judaica, and will eventually, along with the rest of the family, move to Israel, which is a kind of ironic ending for, these two dedicated communists. Um, Solomon's letters are filled with incredible descriptions of his experiences in the Red Army, with his various shifts in mood, periods where he's deeply depressed, periods where he's elated, documentation of Nazi crimes, um, his kind of understanding of Soviet policies that are evolving during the war that they're actively discussing. This is also a great document of just love and devotion. The way that the two of them care for each other from a distance throughout the war is really incredible. It's also a very interesting document for about interethnic relations within the Soviet Union and the Red Army. And so the ways that I have used this, again, I'll start with the classroom and then I'll talk about how I'm using this in my research. I just finished teaching a course at Sarah Lawrence that was a history of the Second World War, and I curated about 9 letters from their correspondence and had my students read them alongside the letters of a German soldier from the beginning of the war. And many of my students said that this was the most interesting thing that they read all semester, just because it really humanized these events in a way that they were not expecting. Um, and in my research, the censorship article that I showed you is built largely on the Kantsidikas letters. And I've also published on the ways in which political officers and chaplains in the Red Army and the U.S. Army, respectively, during the Second World War, impacted the way the said soldiers wrote and kind of tried to influence the way that soldiers wrote. And Kantsidikas plays a huge role in that as well. And then also in the monograph that I'm writing, these letters appear in every chapter because this is like an ideal source. It is a dedicated communist political officer who actually survives long enough to leave a very long paper trail and who has opinions on all sorts of things. And again, one of these guys who's a dedicated communist, but actually is quite critical of a number of things, is a very, clear thinking individual. Um, and I want to show one more resource. It was also something that I recently used. This is something I've used mostly for teaching, less so in my research, which is this letter that Lev Fine receives from one of the few surviving members of his community, Sima, who we don't actually know what Sima's last name is. And what this is basically um, Sima, who was one of his friends from from what we can tell, not actually a particularly close friend from before the war, finds out that Lev Fine is alive, finds out that he's in the Red Army, and tells her incredibly harrowing story of surviving in Minsk as one of the few surviving as a Jew in Minsk, both her experiences trying to escape Minsk before the fascists came, her experiences in the Minsk ghetto, and then her experiences living under an assumed identity until the liberation of Minsk by the Red Army. And it's basically, in 5 pages, she lays out this incredible account of survival and then eventually asks him to take vengeance for her, as he's still in the active army. And this, again, was one of the documents that many of my students responded very strongly to because it really gives you a capsule experience, a capsule biography of someone's experience during the war, written from the first person. Um, with that, I'm going to open things up to questions. I hope we've whetted your appetite, and Julie and I both look forward to being interrogated. So I will stop sharing, and we can turn things over.